Ahmad, what we're hearing out of Kandahar and Lashkar Gah is fierce fighting in the streets, some of the worst fighting, in fact, in decades of war, that the Taliban is inside of these cities, there's hand-to-hand combat. All of this is incredibly worrying.
Well, thank you for having me on. The Taliban have been pursuing a strategy of military takeover in Afghanistan, aided and abetted and supported with material supplies, manpower supplies from the country across our southern frontier. Instead of actually pursuing a strategy of peace, of reducing violence, of actually making progress on the negotiating table with the Afghan government, the Taliban are pursuing the opposite, which is having a reaction, obviously, in Afghanistan, because hundreds and thousands of people across the country in areas where the Taliban have pushed their terrorism and violence are arming up and, together with the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, putting up resistance against the Taliban and their encroachment of terrorism.
The Afghan government has for some time reassured its people, as well as the world, that it is ready, or it will be ready when the Taliban come from major cities, that it has the capability for that. Well, now appears to be that time. Is it ready?
Absolutely, and you are beginning to see, you're actually seeing fierce resistance, not just by the people who've armed themselves in support of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, but also to protect their own homes. You're beginning to see that the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces themselves have actually consolidated their ranks. They're pushing back against the Taliban incursions and encroachment, and you're beginning to see very high levels of casualties by these terrorists who are trying to push in. And those are some of the things we do not want to produce casualties to kill these terrorists out of for nothing, but they're encroaching into these cities and they're putting up a stiff fight and a resistance. And not only that, but the Afghan political scene is actually uniting. You saw yesterday that all of the major political figures converged in Kabul and declared their support for Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, but also for this defense against the Taliban's terrorism and encroachment. So while the door for peace for us remains open, we have a team in Doha that is pursuing negotiations or trying to pursue negotiations with the Taliban, but we're also prepared to meet the Taliban stiffly in the battlefield. And we are doing that in all of the cities that you mentioned, Kandahar, Herat, and Lashkar Gah.
You know, Afghan security forces have not been able to contain the Taliban, as we've seen in the last several weeks, in rural areas, as the Taliban have gained control of about half of the country geographically. Also, airstrikes have been relied upon in the past pretty heavily to beat them back. But in a city center like Kandahar, which is, of course, the second largest city in Afghanistan, it gets more and more difficult to use airstrikes as a backup when all of these people are at risk. So what makes you believe that Afghan security forces will be successful in these more populated areas?
Well, I'm glad you're asking that question, because what you're talking about is the Taliban are pushing the violence and terrorism in populated areas, civilian populated areas. And not only that, they're actually using civilian homes and other civilian objects like clinics as cover to avoid any kind of airstrike, but also to avoid any kind of retaliation. And the result, obviously, of that is that civilian casualties tend to increase. So you've seen in the UN report released a few days ago that civilian casualties, unfortunately, has gone up by approximately 47%, to be precise. And all of that coincides with this strategy of the Taliban pushing into populated areas, using civilian homes as cover, but also using indirect fire, such as mortars, in civilian areas, which has caused an increase in civilian casualties. But not only that, in years past, in the so-called summer fighting season, the Taliban were able to only create trouble, security conflict in approximately 13, 14 provinces in the country's 34 provinces. This year, they've been able to do that in more than 30 provinces. So the result the net result of their pushing of the violence into civilian areas, using tactics that endanger civilian homes, but also using indirect fire in civilian populated areas, the Taliban have driven up civilian casualties by up to 47% based on UN figures. And unfortunately, because they're using civilian homes, nearly 2/3 of all of these civilian casualties are women and children. And so we are having to defend the cities in situations where the Taliban are using these civilian objects as their shield, which, like you rightly pointed out, is difficult, but we're taking all the measures we can to make sure that the casualties are minimized for the civilians. And these are reflected in the UN figures, because the Afghan government has been found to be only responsible for approximately 26% of the casualties. That's still 26% too many, but we're doing all we can to reduce that.
All right. Well, hopefully the capability is there in these cities. It's a terrifying situation. Ahmad, Shuja, Jamal, thanks for joining us.